foreign policy, 1945 to today. What we're going to see develop in the United States is basically two trends. The first is that we are going to seek peace through collective security. And collective security is a world community that agrees to work together in order to protect any nation that is being threatened. And because of this, the United Nations, or the UN, is created in 1945. And the UN's job is to promote this cooperation among the world's nations and to maintain international peace. However, throughout most of its history, the UN has been very largely dependent on the cooperation between the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union. So that's the first trend, that collective security, working together, cooperating with the rest of the world community. That's been the first thing. The second is this policy of deterrence. And deterrence is making the U.S. and our allies so strong militarily that no one's going to want to attack us, that it will prevent an attack because nobody wants to test us out. This starts with President Truman. He's going to build up our nuclear arsenal. And by having so many weapons, it's supposed to deter, which is where we get deterrence. It is supposed to deter anyone from attacking us because we have this wide array of weapons that we will use or can use or could use, have the potential to use. And so these two policies of collective security and deterrence are going to help shape U.S. foreign policy from World War II up till today. So obviously the vast majority of our foreign policy dealt with the Cold War because of the Soviet Union, and so trying to resist the Soviet aggression of them trying to promote communism and that kind of thing. So we have more than 40 years of tense relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't join the United Nations because they felt that the U.S. only wanted democratic governments in the UN, and that if somebody was not democratic, that we would force democracy onto them, and Russia wasn't going to change, and they wanted other nations to have communist governments. So at first they don't join, but they do eventually. The Truman Doctrine is going to begin in 1947, and it was begun to counter against communist governments. And Truman will begin with this policy called containment. Now, we learned about this last year in U.S. history, so it should be just kind of a brief review. But containment is where we're trying to contain communism and prevent its spread. And I think I talked about this last year, that containment sounds like a container. So when you have leftovers, you put it in your refrigerator, you put it in a container, because if you leave it in there for too long and it gets all moldy, you don't want that mold to spread through your refrigerator, right? You want it to be within this container, and you can just toss the container away. So that's kind of the idea, really basic idea, but it's the idea of what containment's all about, that we're going to contain communism so it can't spread to the rest of the world, and eventually it'll poison itself, and then we can toss it out, sort of thing. So that's what this is really dealing with. Basically, we end up fighting two wars because of this policy. Depending on how you see it, we're either not successful or somewhat successful. But anyway, the containment policy was created by George F. Kennan. It is Kennan, Kennan, and he is the founder, and he was a U.S. agent who was spying on the Soviet Union. And he sends this letter back to Truman saying that I've figured out this way to stop communism, that communism will eventually collapse on itself. It cannot be self-sustainable. It won't be self-sustainable. So he comes up with this containment policy, and this policy is based on two defenses and two responses. The defenses are the stronghold and perimeter defense. How are we going to defend against communism? How are we going to protect ourselves? And so the stronghold says that we will protect 5 centers, the ones that we want to make sure are always democratic and will never become anything but. So we're going to protect the United States, we're going to protect Great Britain, who was our ally, we're going to protect France, who was our ally in World War II. And then we're going to protect 2 major conflict areas, and that's Germany, which is where both world wars started, and Japan, who we soundly defeated, and we want them to be our democratic voice in Asia. So we're going to protect those. We're going to defend. We're going to protect those 5 centers and make sure that they will not fall to communism. So if there's ever a threat there, that's who we're going to defend. The second defense is a perimeter defense, and basically perimeter is like if you're scouting your perimeter, you're scouting the entire area. So in a perimeter defense, wherever communism crops up, we're going to be there to stop it. So no matter where it is, it doesn't have to be those 5 centers, no matter where it is. So if it's in Brazil, or if it's in Australia, or if it's in I don't know, Africa somewhere. Can't think of anywhere. We will be there to defend against it. That's kind of the idea. So of these two, obviously the most expensive one is going to be perimeter defense. And so looking at, our resources, what can we afford to do? It entirely depends on the administration of what they're going to decide. Yeah, we can do this. So like I said, there's also 2 responses. And you have a symmetrical response, which is, if you go back to geometry, symmetrical is equal. And so our response is going to be equal to whatever their action was. So whatever action they're doing, we do the same. So if they send in propaganda and speakers, we're sending in propaganda and speakers to wherever we're defending. Asymmetrical, our response is going to be greater than their action. So whatever they're doing, we're going to one-up them. We're going to make sure that they get the message that we're not messing around. So like if they're sending in money, we're going to send in propaganda and speakers. If they're sending in propaganda and speakers, we're going to send in soldiers. If they send in soldiers, we're going to make Moscow a parking lot because we're going to drop a nuclear weapon on them. So it's this policy of one-upmanship kind of thing, that we're going to make sure that they know we mean business, that we're not just messing around, we're not just going to match them. So like I said, with the defenses, there's one that's obviously more expensive. Same thing with responses. There's one that's obviously more expensive to do. And that's the asymmetrical, because we're always going to be one step ahead of them. So again, it depends on our administration at the time of what they think we can spend. How much money can we spend to prevent communism from cropping up wherever it is? If we are in a stronghold symmetrical, if it's not one of our centers and it's, like South Africa or something going to communism, we're not going to bother with it because it's not in our scope for that one. Anyway, so containment policy is based on 4 foundations. There's 4 policy foundations. The first is that our disagreements with the Soviet Union will be made public. They will know why we don't like them. They will know that we don't approve of certain actions that they do. The second is that we will give no more concessions, so we're not going to give in anymore to them, that we're not going to let them just have stuff. We will challenge them every step of the way. The third is that the U.S. military, we are going to build it up. And this is that policy of deterrence. We're going to build it up. We're going to make ourselves a credible threat. We're going to make sure that they know that we can do what we promise that we're going to do. We're also going to help our allies. We're going to give them military and economic aid because we want our allies to be very strong as well. We don't want them to be targets. And so, again, that's that policy of deterrence. And then number 4 is that we're going to continue to negotiate with the Soviets. We don't want to completely cut off that possibility, but we aren't ever going to give in something to them if we don't get something in return. So we will only negotiate if it's in our benefit, if it's to our benefit. So the goals of containment is that we want to restore the balance of power. We want to make sure that their enemies become our allies. And that can be kind of dangerous territory at times because occasionally their enemies are dictators. And as long as they're enemies of the Soviet Union, that's okay. We will accept them as dictators because at least they're enemies of the Soviet Union. And that can kind of get us into problems. The second goal is that we're going to reduce the Soviet ability to influence countries. So we want to make sure that we create sort of a break between the Soviet Union and other communist countries like China, like Cuba, and other countries as they turn communist. We want to make sure that there's a definite break between them. Make sure that we know that they know that your communism is okay as long as you don't do this, but Soviet communism is like the devil's work. We don't want anything to do with them. So we try to make sure that there's a huge distinction, and so that they won't associate or have anything to do with the Soviets. Not always as successful as we'd like, but we do try. And the third goal is that we will have long-term behavior modifications that we're going to negotiate to get them to do what we want them to do. Like I said, we will never negotiate if we're not going to gain something. We only do it if we're going to get something in return. So there are several other incidences that will take place that deal with this whole idea of containment. You have the Berlin blockade, which we got into quite a bit in U.S. history, where the U.S. is going to try and cut off supplies to Berlin, and we overpower it with our airlift. The Korean War will begin in 1950, and it begins when South Korea is attacked by the communist Northern Korea. And the UN, the United Nations, is going to step in to help out South Korea. The war lasts for 3 years, and it ends up becoming a battle between the U.S. and South Korea are going to join forces against China, which is communist, and North Korea, which was communist. But remember, China is not the same kind of communism as the Soviet communism. So we're kind of fighting a different battle than we would be if the Soviets were involved. And then eventually the Soviets do get involved later on in the war, so it does change things a little bit. But the U.S. costs are going to be pretty huge, but we consider it worth it because South Korea is going to be saved, as it is still today. You have communist North Korea and a democratic nationalist South Korea. The next incident is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this is the first major confrontation. I mean, we got to the brink of war. We were almost in a nuclear war because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But basically, the U.S. gets information that Cuba was getting Soviet missiles. Don't like that because Cuba is so close to us, and so we set up a blockade to stop the Soviet shipments from coming into Cuba. And it's a huge challenge to Khrushchev. And JFK, President Kennedy, is heading up our administration at the time, and it's a 13-day standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we are so close to nuclear war at that time. I don't think most people really understood just how close we could have come to a nuclear war. But eventually the Soviets are forced to back down. And that's because we're using not only our policy of containment, but also our policy of deterrence, that we were showing the Soviets that we were not afraid to take them on, that we had the nuclear capabilities and we had the weaponry to wipe out Cuba, and we could have done it. We would have done it if it had come to that point. And so it came down to who's going to blink first, and the Soviets ended up blinking first. That we were very strong in our defense of our nation. And then we have the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War wanted freedom. The Vietnamese wanted freedom from France. France was the colonizer of Vietnam. Vietnam was a colony. That's probably an easier way to say it. Vietnam is a colony of France, and they wanted freedom from France. They also wanted freedom from the communist forces that were coming in. So the Vietnamese didn't want to be communist. They also didn't want to be under French control. Well, that's going to lead to a civil war that begins in Vietnam because not everybody was in agreement on that. It divides Vietnam into two regions. In the north, you'll have the communist forces of Vietnam, and in the south, you'll have the anti-communists. Now, they didn't want to be communist, but they also weren't really sure about being a democracy either. So they're more considered nationalists, that they just wanted to be able to make decisions for their own country rather than being controlled by communists or Democrats. So, this begins a civil war in Vietnam, and the U.S. is going to support South Vietnam, and Russia and China are going to support North Vietnam. And so we're in this war for a very long period of time, and eventually the U.S. gets out of there, and Vietnam becomes the Socialist Republic in 1975. So the communists end up winning. In response, the U.S. does have, some successes there, but not a whole ton. So it's kind of an interesting end to our war there. Anyway, so the next couple of policies are going to look at some tweaking that they do to the current policies of containment and deterrence and collective security, and then we're going to be looking at how countries and why countries behave the way they do.